Ahoy everyone! So this is going to be my very first YouTube video on completing a sewing project that I just recently did. I have a couple of other videos on this channel, but they were from many years ago and they're not very good. This is my first time really attempting to do a fully produced making of video. And this video is going to feature the creation of McCall's Costumes 7003. And it is a men's Victorian inspired frock coat. Now I say inspired as this is not a historically accurate pattern, nor does it try to claim to be. It's a really nice pattern. The instructions are pretty clear, though I didn't really use them very often. I used bespoke tailoring methods on this, which means that I did pad stitching, I used horsehair canvas, I used taped seam lines, and a lot of handwork went into it. The material that I chose is this really lovely navy gabardine wool that I picked up from my local sophisticated fabric store in Massachusetts, and I have a beautiful polyester velvet and a polyester lining. Now, I was looking to try to do this project on a bit of a budget, so really the most expensive fabric that I ended up buying was the horsehair canvas. Which was to be expected. I only really needed a couple yards of it, and it was worth it for the end result of how the jacket looks. Now, this was my first time really trying to film myself sewing, and I used a video camera that actually didn't end up having a manual focus option on it, nor did it have an automatic focus option on it. So I apologize for some of the video that is out of focus, and hopefully for my next video I will be much better with making sure that I center my shots in such a way that the piece that I'm actually working on is in focus. Go figure. Tab fit on the very lower end of the XL size, and I was worried that if I had sized it down that he wouldn't have enough room across his shoulders. So I ended up cutting out the extra large, and it ended up being a little bit too roomy in the arms, but it did fit really well across his chest. There were a couple other things that I omitted from this that I wouldn't normally do in a standard suit jacket. I did not sew shoulder pads into this. I made shoulder pads for it, but when I tried it on him, the proportions were just not right. He is pretty big across his shoulders and has a very muscular upper chest. The shoulder pads just made it look like he was wearing football padding underneath, and it just didn't really do much for the overall proportion of it. He ended up not really even needing them because the jacket laid really nicely across his shoulders without the shoulder pads. I did, however, have a sleeve head in the sleeves, which helped keep that rounded edge of the sleeve sitting really nicely. So if you are going to use this pattern, I highly recommend at least putting in the sleeve heads. Definitely put in a shoulder pad if your model is not nearly as full across the front of the chest. I began by laying out the patterns on my wool and cutting them out. By this point, I had already made a muslin mock-up of the jacket and fit it on Tavish. Based on the measurements from the pattern, I cut out a size extra large, and as I'll mention at the end of this video, I probably could have sized this down since it ended up being big in the arms. I also cut out the entire jacket out of fusible tricot interfacing and fused it to the wrong side of each piece. This provided a little more stability to the wool and helped with hiding my pad stitching later. I fused with a press cloth to make sure that I didn't scorch the wool at all. Once I was back home, I used the pattern tissue for the front of the jacket as a guide to cut out my horsehair canvas. Horsehair canvas is a woven material usually made with a blend of wool, cotton, polyester, and yes, actual horsehair. The supple weave is perfect for stabilizing lapels, hems, shoulders, and collars, and it's a staple underlining for tailored garments. I also transferred the darts and the lapel row line to the hair canvas. Next, I stitched the darts on the front jacket panels. I pressed the darts toward the center front using a tailor's ham and plenty of steam. Then I pinned the hair canvas to the wrong side of the front jacket pieces. Then I used large pad stitches to baste the hair canvas to the wrong side of wool. These pad stitches are only temporary and they'll be removed when the coat is completed. I also basted along the roll line using a running stitch. The dart in the hair canvas does not get stitched up like the outer wool layer. Instead, the dart is cut off along the legs, pinned to the stitch dart underneath, and stitched in place with catch stitches. This method greatly reduces bulk. Since the hair canvas has a loose weave and the dart has been cut out, the tip of the dart needs to be reinforced so it doesn't wear away over time. I cut a small piece of fusible tricot and fused it to the top of the dart. I also did a few rows of pad stitching for extra security. Now it's time to create the chest piece. The chest piece is made out of flannel or cotton batting and helps with filling out the hollow parts of the chest between bust and shoulder. Tav is pretty beefy, so I just used a scrap piece of fleece and pad stitched it down to the hair canvas layer. Then I began pad stitching the lapels. The pad stitching here is much smaller and will be permanent. The stitches are worked parallel to the lapel row line. As I work the stitches, I'm holding the lapel at a curve, which helps the lapel turn out when it's finished. Next up, I pinned a strip of twill tape to the roll line. The roll line is on the bias of the fabric, so if it's not stabilized, it's prone to stretching out over time. The twill tape is cut slightly shorter than the length of the roll line, and the excess is eased in as I pin it down. The tape is then stitched down by hand using felling stitches. To further stabilize the outer edge of the jacket, the opening of the jacket is also edged with twill tape along the stitching line and fell stitched down. This will help the jacket hang straight when it's worn open. Now that all my hand stitching is completed, it was time to move on to the pockets. First, I created the pocket flaps from blue polyester velvet backed with tricot interfacing. The flaps were stitched, trimmed, and pressed. When working with a high pile fabric like velvet, it's very helpful to have a needleboard to help with pressing. The needleboard allows you to iron over the velvet without crushing the fibers. I also used a press cloth here to help distribute the heat and barely used any pressure with the iron. I mostly pressed this velvet with my hands. Next, I transferred the pattern markings for the pocket placement onto the fronts of the jacket. Then I pinned the flaps in place. I stitched the pocket flaps down to the front of the jacket. Next up are the pocket bags. These are cut from my lining material. The first one is pinned to the upper front of the jacket and stitched down. Here you can see I've replaced my standard presser foot with an even feed or walking foot. This foot is incredibly helpful when sewing slippery materials like linings and velvet. Next, the bottom pocket bags are pinned to the bottom front panel of the jacket. These are stitched in a rectangle shape to allow space for a hand to fit through. These are then understitched, clipped, turned to the outside, and pressed. Now the upper portion of the jacket is pinned to the bottom portion of the jacket. The pocket bags are pulled out of the way so they don't get caught up in the seam. Then I stitched along the seam line, ignoring the pockets. After I clipped the previous seam and pressed it, I went in and stitched the pocket bags together along the curved edges. So my video camera decided to stop working for a little while, so I was not able to film a few things. At this point, the body of the jacket is sewn together, the sleeves were sewn up and set in. The upper collar was pad stitched and sewn on. Here they're pictured with sleeve heads, which I also did off camera. The back of the jacket has a vent, which here is hand basted together with long pad stitches. I also completed the lining off camera. The lining is cut from almost all of the same pattern pieces except for the front panels. Since the inside of the jacket shows when the lining is turned, the outer wool and the velvet is sewn together as a facing to the inside. This was a tricky little area to sew since I was sewing velvet, slippery lining material, and wool all in one seam. The walking foot was such a huge help here, and I managed to get it perfectly the first time. Did I also mention that this lining photographs like absolute crap? I promised I pressed these seams several times each, and it looks way better in the final jacket. And now on to the hem of the jacket. At this point, I've already stitched the lining to the jacket along the center front seam and neckline, and I apologize for not having filmed that part too. The hem has to be eased in since the jacket has a little bit of flare, so here I am turning up the lower edge, matching the seams, and hand basting the edges together. Now I can steam out the extra fullness. I'm a fan of using my hands to press out fullness when I'm scared about my iron making shiny spots on my wool. Also, I don't own a wooden clapper, so my sleeve ham does some double duty here. Now it's time to pin in the lining. The lining was cut shorter than the full length of the jacket and gets turned under and pinned about an inch from the edge. This is to help keep the lining from pulling too tightly and causing the hem to buckle. I went all around the edge of the jacket and made sure all the edges were evenly turned up. I paid very close attention to the length of the back vent here as well. Next up, I very carefully slip stitched the lining to the jacket with small handwork stitches. This is my preferred method to attach hems. I know I could have bagged the whole thing, but that's just not as satisfying as putting it in by hand. Overall, I'm really happy with how the jacket came out. I did not have time to do nice bound buttonholes, so my mediocre keyhole buttonholes on my machine had to do. Tav looked very dashing at the ball, and here he is with Bettina wearing the Queen Victoria gown I made her at the Victoria and Albert Ball, hosted by the Commonwealth Vintage Dancers. Give this video a like and a comment, and maybe hit that subscribe button if you're interested in seeing more of my content in the future. Thanks!